Hi all, welcome back. Today I'll be lecturing about Chapter 1 of Living with Robots, and that chapter is called The Substitute. Finally, we're going to get into the meat of the text and not just a preview. Before I get into that, I did want to clear up a little bit of confusion. I received a few emails and actually saw very late into the week that some of you were looking at an assignment that didn't appear in the modules page. Something that was discussion for chapter 1. Unfortunately, there was a ghost assignment in the shell that somehow didn't get cleared out. Anything that I assign you will appear here on the homepage. You don't have to do anything that doesn't appear here in the home page, which is the modules page of our course Canvas shell. So for this week, for example, what you're going to have to do is the chapter 1 reading quiz, which hopefully you've already completed by the time you're watching this lecture. You're watching chapter 1 lecture. You'll do the chapter 1 post-lecture quiz after viewing the lecture, and then you'll have to do a diagnostic test, which is a short 2-page essay assignment. So these are all the assignments you have to do this week, and moving forward, all of the assignments will be on this. Sorry for any confusion that might have caused, and judging by how many of you participated in that discussion, a fair amount. So I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to do about that, but just know that moving forward, all the assignments will appear on in the module section. All right, so now jumping into the content of the course. So the first thing that this chapter opens with is an effect called the Uncanny Valley. So let's take a look at a chart that represents that effect. All right, so the Uncanny Valley is an effect that shows that as things more resemble human beings, the more familiar with them we are, the more comfortable around them we are, the more we like them, up to a certain point. And then there's this effect where we get very uncomfortable with them, as they're very much like us. But then as they're more and more precise about being like us, then we get more and more comfortable. So the y-axis here is familiarity, comfort level. The x-axis here is human likeness. So as you can see, let's look at the solid line first. As things get more and more like us, we like them. So stuffed animals, they have eyes, mouth, ears. We like them, they're cute. But as things get more like human beings, you see things like a corpse here, we get less comfortable with them. So usually people are more comfortable with stuffed animals than corpses. So you see this effect that we're more and more comfortable with something, the more it looks like us, but then at a certain point we get less comfortable with it. But then note, as it gets more like us, we become more comfortable with it. So something like it says the artistic expression of the human ideal. So you can imagine a statue like the statue of David, very comfortable around that, and we like it. So now as things are moving as we start talking about moving things, the effect is even more exaggerated. The more like us something gets, the more we like it. You get up to the point of a humanoid robot. And things are looking pretty good, but then as things get a little bit more like us, you fall into this uncanny valley. And we like it less and less. But then as things get more and more like us, it trends up, and we see that you achieve the point where we're as comfortable with something as a healthy human person. And then the chart extends even more, and our authors make a big deal about this, that something could be even more, we could be even more familiar with it, more comfortable with it than a human being. And they tag that cyborg Buddha. So the Uncanny Valley is the name of an effect such that as things get more and more like us, we get more comfortable with them up to a certain point, and then there's this Uncanny Valley effect, this dip, where we get less comfortable, and then we get more and more comfortable. Why do the authors include this? We won't spend much time with it because it seems they're just making a pretty small point about it. And that point is, as robots more closely resemble humans, we find them more terrifying in that Uncanny Valley. And one thing they note is, or one theory that they like about this, is that we fear the features that they share with us, not the things that are dissimilar from us. And they hypothesize that this is a result of our fear of each other and our uncomfortability with or discomfort with social interactions with each other, that they come with, that they're so complex and there are so many different ways that they can go wrong. And always the fear that they might fall apart completely. And as robots approach us, the authors hypothesize that some of these same fears crop up. So, this is an effect that roboticists have to worry about depending on the goals of what their machines are. If comfort with the machine is important, then you want to make sure that you're either prior to the Uncanny Valley or after the Uncanny Valley in terms of likeness to human beings. And this issue especially comes up when we get to talking about substitutes, and that's what the authors ultimately want to talk about in this chapter. So let's jump into talking about substitutes, what the authors mean by it, and some distinctions. So the definition: an authorized surrogate who plays the role of someone else, but only in certain cases, in certain respects, and at certain moments. So they offer some examples, like an automated nurse's aide, an automated nanny, or an automated receptionist or pet. These are things which might play the roles of things which they're temporarily replacing, but they aren't going to be permanent replacements. A nanny isn't going to, it's very far off that an automated being would raise a human being from childhood to adulthood, but they might play sort of a supervisory role and a role in guiding them to certain behaviors and away from other behaviors. That doesn't seem too difficult to imagine. And a receptionist, an automated receptionist, wouldn't be able to do all the work of a human receptionist, but might perform some of the roles in some cases. So those are the sorts of things that they're talking about here. An example that helped me get my head around this idea was the example that I posted in the first discussion thread, the example of the fur hat robot, the one that's a head with a face projected on it from the inside. One of its functions was to help in, or one of the programs that was displayed in that video was the robot acting as a language teacher and taking the role temporarily of a language teacher, and then also taking the role of participants in a discussion. And this helped me think about what a substitute could do, because in that case, it was temporarily taking the role of the teacher, temporarily taking the role of conversation partners, but not trying to replace entirely other people when it comes to learning a foreign language. If you're really going to get fluent in a foreign language, you're going to eventually need to talk to other people, and the robot isn't trying to completely replace them, just temporarily in the case of language learning, when you don't have another partner, when you can't go take a class, that the robot could substitute for, take over some of those roles in that context. The authors distinguish what they call substitutes from replacements. So an automated robot on a factory floor, they give as an example of a replacement. A replacement is something that does exactly what it says. It replaces human beings. So the role of these machines on factory floors is often to completely replace a human being, to bring down labor costs and concerns about labor organization. And you don't have to worry about those things as much, or it brings your costs down, and you don't have to worry about labor issues as much as you would with human beings. Another distinction it brings up is not all robots which serve social functions are substitutes. Also, I'm tempted to say all substitutes are social robots, but not vice versa. So the example it gives is of the bed, that the Rayson robot, which transforms from a bed to a chair and back to help people more easily get into and out of bed. That serves a social role, but the authors rightly claim that it's not an agent. It's not substituting for a person in that role. So, substitutes are inanimate objects automated substitutes are inanimate objects capable of temporarily taking over a role and exercising authority in that role. So the next thing that the chapter tackles is it gives examples of 3 qualities that a social robot would have to have that a substitute would have to have in order to have what the authors are going to call social autonomy. So these are necessary conditions for social autonomy. The first condition is what the text is going to call adaptability. So a key thing about human sociability is our ability to adapt to circumstances. So social creatures like us don't serve any one particular purpose. So for a substitute to take over the roles that we have, they're going to need to be able to disengage from whatever program they happen to be running, whatever task they're engaged in, and be able to switch to another program or another task and adapt to their environment in the flexible way that we're able to adapt. A problem is that in social environments, new and unforeseeable circumstances very often arise. So when you're engaged in a conversation with one person, a car crash happens in the distance and we start talking about that, or somebody else joins the conversation, and it's difficult to think about what sort of complex programming would have to go into creating a substitute which was as adaptable as we are. The text says full success in terms of adaptability will come when a robot is created that serves no purpose, because it can serve any purpose. Here I'm reminded of Seinfeld, where it's a show about nothing. If somebody could create a robot that was for nothing, because it could be for anything, then that would be the ultimate goal. The next necessary criteria for autonomy, according to the text, for being a good substitute, would be presence. So a good substitute will have to make its presence felt. Unlike cell phones and laptops, which first of all, we only notice when they malfunction, and second of all, don't share space with us, but instead provide us access to a parallel space. Robots share our physical space, and if they're going to have social autonomy, then if they're going to be a good substitute, they have to have that sort of presence where you can't ignore them. They assert their presence in our lives. And to go back to the cell phone and laptop point, I only think about my laptop when, like, say, the P button isn't working, and if everything's working as is, then I'm just working on my projects or accessing the internet and looking in that what it calls parallel space. So you may have noticed if you're around people a lot and they're on their devices, it's almost as if they're not there. They're engaging in this world that sort of runs parallel to our own. Robots, on the other hand, are there in the space with you. So again, I'll refer back to that fur hat robot that was the head with the face projected on the back of it. You can imagine like being in the room with that robot and it just talking to you, and it would be difficult to just ignore it. And furthermore, I've seen some applications done with robots that these authors would consider substitutes, where they are used to train people in confrontational circumstances. So it's one thing to do that on a flat computer screen where there's like a digital representation of somebody upset at you. It's another thing when you share space with something. Like if that fur hat robot was making angry faces and constantly coming at me with like objections to things that I was saying, I can imagine feeling like in a similar way that I would if a person was doing that same sort of stuff. So the fact that it's taking up physical space matters as far as what it's able to do. The authors distinguish substitutes from what they call telepresent robots. Those are robots where like people are controlling them remotely. So unlike those robots where people are controlling them remotely, a substitute would have to act on its own to really have that social autonomy, to be able to exercise authority in the roles that we want them to play. And finally, authority. So the authors make some careful distinctions between authority relations and what they call power relations. So some examples they go through. A teacher in class, they'll say, if they're doing it right, they'll have authority, whereas an ATM will merely exert power. An ATM doesn't have authority. So think about an interaction with an ATM. It's never giving you a chance to comply. If you put your card in and it says it's invalid, then often it'll just eat that card or not give it back to you. And it doesn't give it back to you and say, you should you should surrender your card. It just takes it. And that's all there is to that, right? So that's a power relation. The ATM is just telling you how it is. Compare that to a teacher in class or a parent that might have authority. They'll give good reasons why somebody should comply. So you should do this assignment, and if not, there'll be a series of rewards and lack of rewards and consequences if you do a bad thing, or rewards and lack of consequences if you do a good thing. And they give you a chance to comply and see where and when you'll comply and act accordingly. Whereas an ATM will just do what it's programmed to do and exert its power. So the difference there between a teacher having authority and an ATM having power. Another difference that another set of cases that it explores is the difference between traffic lights and speed bumps. Traffic lights are an example of exercising authority, so they just present you with a color, and because of all the sets of rules and rewards and punishments that surround them, you're not forced to follow, but you're obligated to follow. So there's an important difference. Whereas if there are speed bumps in the road, those have to be addressed. They will force compliance or super bad consequences. So traffic lights exercise authority, whereas speed bumps use power to force you into compliance. So summing up all three criteria of adaptability, presence, and authority, examples that it compares are nanny robots that can adapt to children's behavior and use its presence in the room with them to exercise authority, to guide them to certain behaviors and away from other behaviors while not physically forcing them and moving them, using series of rewards and punishments to guide behavior, and compare that to an electronic surveillance system that automatically locks doors and like I'm imagining cameras on people. So electronic surveillance system doesn't really have presence in the same way that a nanny robot does, where it's in the room with you. The electronic surveillance system, the different parts, like the part that locks the door, the camera that views you, it doesn't feel like an agent there with you. It's just acting upon you. So it forces compliance by like locking doors, whereas the nanny robot would try to get compliance, try to use its authority to get compliance. A nanny robot in this example could also be adaptable to different levels of compliance that children often exhibit, whereas an electronic surveillance system, you can imagine that it senses somebody walking in, the door locks, something like that, right? So the nanny robot in this example would have social autonomy. The electronic surveillance system wouldn't be an agent. It wouldn't be a substitute. It wouldn't have what the authors call social autonomy. So now let's get into some theories of autonomy. So we're going to put a finer point on what our authors mean by autonomy and what they don't mean. So first, a theory of autonomy that they ultimately want to criticize. So a theory of autonomy was proposed according to which there are 3 levels of autonomy, and each new level builds on previous levels. So so the early levels are necessary conditions for later levels. And upon this view, the first level of autonomy is energy autonomy. So the ability to keep oneself going, to not have to be directly supplied energy by something else. Or if something is directly provided by energy by something else, to be able to seek that out and then move away from it and then seek it out again. In this context and in the next one, the authors bring up an automated lawnmower. So the lawnmower sits in its battery, sort of like a Roomba, I imagine, sits in its battery, and then when it's appropriate, it goes out and mows the lawn, and then it comes back and sits and gets more energy. So that device would have energy autonomy. The next level on top of that is motivational autonomy, so the ability to do what one wants. We certainly have both of these levels of autonomy. We have energy autonomy, so we're able to eat food when we need to, and then go do other stuff when we want to, so we have motivational autonomy. And the authors will build the case that not only do we have that, but also things like a Roomba or the automated lawnmower also have motivational autonomy when they want, put that in quotation marks, to go out and mow the lawn. They go out and mow the lawn, and then when they recognize that they need more power, they want to go back to their power source. I recognize the slight anthropomorphizing that's going on with using the word want here. There's a more complicated analysis. You can get that in the text, that their mental states I'll leave it to the text. We won't get into it here. So the next level is mental autonomy. Mental autonomy is not just the ability to do what one wants, but the further ability to be able to control what it is that they want. Now, this is a pretty impressive ability that we like to think that we have. So I sometimes really like eating a lot of dessert. I got a sweet tooth, so I like to eat cake. Now, not only do I have the ability to do that if I want to, I can go find a piece of cake or make a piece of cake and eat it, but also I have some limited control over what it is that I want. If I've noticed over the course of my life that the more I eat cake, the more I want it the next day. Like, I get these urges, I'm in this like sugar cycle. And once I recognize that, I have mental autonomy, and I have the ability to act in ways that will shape my desires. So to a limited extent, right? Like, I'll still think about cake occasionally, but if I don't eat it for a week straight, my desire for it is much less. So I can not only do what I want to do, but on top of that, I can also control, I can do things that will have an effect on my desires. So that would be the level of mental autonomy. That's one that, if it's a thing, robots don't seem to have. They don't seem to be able to act on their desires. Their desires are programmed into them by outside sources, and they don't have the ability to control what it is that their behavior is directed at. So the authors offer some criticisms of this view. The first criticism is that the three levels of freedom are not actually distinct. They actually describe one kind of autonomy. So consider the case of the automated lawnmower. It has energy autonomy and it has motivational autonomy. But something that the authors point out here is that the lawnmower only has energy autonomy because it has motivational autonomy. So it's only able to keep itself going because it recognizes when it's low on batteries and then is able to do what it needs to do to take action to get back to that energy source. So it's only in virtue of it having motivational autonomy that it has energy autonomy. So these two are not very easily separated. The next criticism of the view is that elements of it are too broad. So consider the example that they give of the photo of a lamp with a photovoltaic cell. So apparently that's one that can take in light and store it and give it out later, like when the lights are off. So it's sunny outside, it takes in the light, and then at night it gives off that light. Now, it would be weird to say that that lamp is autonomous, even if all we were saying was that it has energy autonomy. But it seems to fit the definition of energy autonomy. It keeps itself going just by continuing to take in the light and then give it off. But it's not doing anything, so it's weird to say that's something that isn't acting in some sort of way is autonomous. So the definition of autonomy here is too broad. It says that some things are autonomous which really don't seem to be autonomous. For example, that lamp. And finally, the final criticism is that it's too narrow. So this would exclude some social robots. You can imagine a really advanced, like technologically advanced, the kind that we don't even have now, social robot that was plugged into a wall so that it had no energy autonomy. But this advanced robot could have motivational autonomy and mental autonomy. So it's difficult to, it would be weird to exclude that highly advanced social robot while including the photovoltaic lamp. So these are pretty damning criticisms of this view. So instead of this view on autonomy, the authors offer us an alternative, and they say an autonomous system is one that, in acting on itself and its environment, is able to preserve its functional integrity. So if you've been falling asleep because my lecture is boring, or not paying attention too much, pay attention to this, because now that we're talking about freedom and autonomy, this is something I feel like I can speak on with some authority, and consequently it'll probably be on some tests upcoming. So an autonomous system is one that, in acting on itself and its environment, is able to preserve its functional autonomy. So some integrity. So some virtues of this. It's a simpler view. Consider the lawnmower. The lawnmower meets the criteria for this definition of autonomy. It's able to keep itself going. It's able to cut the grass to a length where it's not overgrown and can't do its thing. It meets the criteria for autonomy here. And it doesn't fall short of anything in this definition of autonomy. It doesn't fall short of what the earlier definition called mental autonomy. Second, it's not too broad. So this definition would not have the lamp with a photovoltaic cell as being autonomous, or if it was, it would have a vanishingly small level of autonomy. And that's because the lamp isn't acting on itself. It isn't acting on its environment. It's just being affected by its environment. So it's not really acting at all. So this definition would not include the photovoltaic lamp, and that's a good thing about this definition of autonomy. Third, this definition of autonomy is relational instead of internal. So it has to do with the relationship between the being in question and its environment. The authors hold that autonomy without action or without a relationship in which a relationship between an environment in which something acts and that something is incoherent. So you can't have this mental autonomy without an environment in which to act. Like thoughts without any possibility of action aren't autonomous. And this definition goes along with their line on that. Along those same lines, the fourth virtue of this theory is that it rejects mental autonomy, which this text says is simply... So I'll read this little section of text. It's on page 49. There's no such thing as pure absolute autonomy. Mental autonomy, in the sense in which McFarland understands it, not only does not exist, it is impossible. Autonomy can only be relative and relational, for it involves actions that are only possible within an appropriate environment. Total independence with regard to one's surroundings is an illusion. Autonomy occurs in the context of a range of possible actions that transform one's surrounding. The autonomy of an agent is always relative to a certain setting or milieu, and it gives rise to a history. The options an autonomous agent selects, which is to say the actions a robot or an organism undertakes in order to attain its objectives, inevitably have the consequence of altering the environment in which it exerts its autonomy. These transformations, in turn, modify the agent's room for maneuver. They constrain it while at the same time giving the robot or organism new opportunities for action. In other words, every autonomous entity inevitably creates a niche for itself in which its autonomy can be securely anchored. This is why the autonomy of McFarland's lawnmower is more metaphorical than real. The lawnmower not only does not create a niche that allows it to exist, it does not even maintain a niche. It receives its autonomy ready-made from the outside. So it gets a little complex because they use the lawnmower example earlier, and then they say, it's more metaphorical than real autonomy for the lawnmower. But the important thing to note here, the autonomy is relational instead of an internal quality. If there's no world in which a being acts, it can't be autonomous. And pure mental autonomy is just a myth. Well, it's not even conceptually possible. The authors think if you're thinking that it is, you're thinking about autonomy in the wrong way. Autonomy is about giving yourself more options in an environment and maintaining your options in that environment. So finally, this definition of autonomy is applicable to social robots. So even the hypothetical advanced social robot that's plugged into a wall has autonomy on this definition. It can be an autonomous system in that it acts on itself and its environment and is able to preserve its functional integrity. In this case, it would be able to run the programs and engage with its environment, which is constituted of partners, of social partners, and be able to still fulfill its role. So it would still meet all the criteria of this definition of autonomy, and it wouldn't meet the other one. This one is the one to be preferred, according to the authors. So now let's talk a little bit more about what it means for a social robot to have autonomy. So according to the authors, it must be able to create its own niche. It must react appropriately when interrupted or canceled by a partner. And it must be able to stop activity based on external events corresponding to some regularity. So it must be the case that we're able to say the robot stopped doing that because of this. Where the because of this is a regular thing. Human beings act based on regularities because we act according to reasons. When talking about an automated object, it must at least make sense that their behavior is similar to as if they were acting based on reasons. 4, autonomy is relational. So the environment in this case, that the robot acts on and in to preserve its functional integrity is primarily comprised of social partners. So they have to act in ways towards their social partners which allow them to maintain their role. Finally, you do not need energy autonomy or mental autonomy in order to be autonomous on this view. You just need to be able to create and preserve your own niche in the world. All right. Finally, this chapter talks about robots as scientific instruments. So it talks about 4 things that we can do that robots can't do. And let me look up those things. So in the first case, they're incapable of laughter or tears. Secondly, they do not blush. Thirdly, they do not commit suicide. So that turns out to be 4 things: laugh, cry, blush, commit suicide. And we haven't crossed that threshold with robots, although I think since writing this text, I think there are robots that can actually laugh. When it comes to using robots as scientific instruments, what's interesting here is we don't quite know the role that each of those behaviors plays in a social system. Why is it possible that we can laugh, cry, blush, and commit suicide? We can speculate about some reasons why we do those things, but perfect knowledge of those things, why anybody does anything, how we're motivated to do things, we don't have full knowledge of the social functions of these behaviors or what motivates us to do them. So on the view of the author, and one thing that robots are used for is as research tools for advancing knowledge of human sociability. Robots, unlike objects on screens, impose themselves. They share our space, so they're more likely to get interactions with them than mere digital beings. And they show the complexity of body and emotion. So the book points out that we're capable already of creating digital beings that laugh, cry, blush, etc. But how do we embody those emotions in a robot? It's complicated at the very least. And how can we do that? Like make robots that embody those those social that give those reactions in a way that's both believable and like morally like acceptable. It's difficult. Something interesting in this context is thinking about robots as an attempt to sort of like create these create beings, like recreate ourselves almost. So the claim is that we won't know the role of our behaviors until we can recreate something or create something in the first place that can exhibit them in appropriate contexts. And only then, when we can create a robot that exhibits these behaviors in appropriate contexts, will we truly understand why we do the things that we do, why we exhibit those behaviors. So to create it's sort of like a reciprocal relationship. To create robots that can do these things in appropriate contexts, we need to understand more about human sociability. And to understand human sociability, creating something that can exhibit our behaviors in believable and acceptable ways would go a long way towards figuring out why we do the things that we do. All right, so that's our chapter on substitutes. So now we're going to finish up with a couple of quiz questions, and then we're all set. So quiz question number 1. According to the authors, which of the following exercise authority? A, an ATM, B, a speed bump, or C, a traffic light? Write down your answer, and when you open the post-lecture quiz, you can answer that question. Question number 2. According to the authors, what should we think about autonomy? A, that it is a relational property concerning how beings relate to their environment. B, whatever the definition of autonomy, it's very clear that a photovoltaic lamp is autonomous. Or C, it is not applicable to social robots. So what should we think about autonomy according to the authors? So those are your 2 quiz questions for this week. Thanks for sticking with this lecture to the end. You might try to break it up in chunks. This chapter is a long haul. It covers a lot of ideas. You might go back and read it after watching the lecture to get fluent with the ideas. All right, thanks for sticking around. I'll see you next time.